Hello, this is Elisa Rodriguez, and this is Arianism Today. Today we're going to look at further the lecture of Dr. Hieser and his Jewish Trinity, which we're going to critique and be a little critical of. So without any further ado, let's begin and see what he's got to say. It's very important, and it's very much so Arianism.
I gave you a little homework last week, and here's where we'll start, answering the question, how in the world could they digest this? One of those passages was Genesis 19:24. Now, did anybody from last week figure out what's odd about this verse? And you read like a Jewish translation, right? And that's fascinating because both of them are the divine name. But what you're telling me is your translation actually translates them differently, correct? Okay, that tells you right there that there's a tension. Because if you look at the verse, you have Yahweh twice. Yahweh rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah sulfurous fire from Yahweh out of heaven. And so Ryan's translation actually reflects, well, we got to do something, we got to distinguish them because it's just kind of freaky that we have Yahweh two times. Yahweh doing something, sending something that came from Yahweh. The wording is just odd. And rabbinical writers in the intertestamental period noticed this. And this became part, I'm going to show you a lot of other passages tonight, this became part of their compulsion to somehow come up with this two powers in heaven idea so that they could deal with their Bible. They knew their Bible really well. Okay, they didn't miss this. They didn't miss the next one either. What's odd about this one?
Okay, so let's look at what he's pointing out right now at this point. So he's pointing out that there is two Yahwehs in that verse. One Yahweh being the one that was speaking to Abraham and all of that. If you look at the rest of Genesis chapter 18, 19, you realize that there is this person who's there who was called a man to begin with under the oak at Mamre. And then when they further along, Abraham is talking to someone who's called Yahweh in the Bible and also called God later on. But when you see this part, it shows that there is a Yahweh on earth, and then there's a Yahweh out of heaven, whereby the fiery brimstones were coming from. And so the issue is that this is where he's getting into the lesser Yahweh, or the Metatron is what it's called in Judaism, is the belief that there was this messenger that was the lesser Yahweh, and so that would be, the Jesus being his mediator role, doing his mediator stuff. And so he, as a scholar, understands this, and I see the same thing, obviously, in Justin Martyr, who called Jesus another God, used this very scripture to describe another God, that there was another God besides the Father, and so the maker of all things. He's very detailed. Justin Martyr is. He's, early 2nd century, 125 probably was when he was writing the Dialogue of Trypho. The issue is that that's consistent with early church. And so if Justin Martyr is calling Jesus another God, it's not consubstantiality. If the Jews understood that there was some Metatron that is not, or the Memra, who is not God himself, this notion is not Trinitarianism. It's two different beings. For Justin Martyr to say another God, and he's talking to Jews who he knows understands the Metatron, and understands the Memra, and understands the lesser Yahweh. And so when you have this Jewish understanding, and he's talking about, and we're talking about a Jesus, Judaism that understands this, you're seeing something very, very striking. That it's not Trinitarianism, although he's trying to show that it's Trinitarianism or pre-Trinitarianism, something like that, but it's not. It's actually a different being, a different person that this lesser Yahweh is, who this other Yahweh is. It's not consubstantiality. Remember, and this is very important, and one of the reasons why John chapter 1 verse 18 is my favorite verse and why I cite it so often, in the New American Standard Version in particular, because it's, no one has ever seen God at any time. The only born God, the only produced God, he was creating him. He was revealing him, who was in the bosom of the Father. And so you're seeing that there's two gods in John chapter 1 verse 18. There's the one God that's never been seen, and then there's the born God that is revealing him. Then you think about there's one God and one mediator between God and man, Christ Jesus. And so you have this issue where Jesus' role as mediator and Shaliah, and word and logos and wisdom and all of that stuff is part and parcel for what he's teaching here. And so that's the issue, is that we have to understand that this is Arianism. This is proof of Arianism. Proof that the Jews believed something that looks like Arianism, that there's no consubstantiality there. We haven't seen any consubstantiality, but we are seeing evidences of what Arianism is. And it's not just me, some, diploma lacking or, doctorate philosophy or theology or biblical theology degree person like me. This is a scholar who is absolutely agreeing with what I'm saying. And so it needs to be taken seriously, not because of what I'm saying or what he's saying, but because the history is there and it's something that's true, and he's pointing it out. And that's why I say that it's absolutely commendable on Dr. Hieser's part to be pointing these things out. I don't agree with the end notion, but it's very true what he's showing, that the notion is that there is a two-ness or a duality there, not a consubstantiality, but then that would be the Son and the Father, the only true God and the only born God. There's a difference there. Another reason why Jesus would be called, we got a lot of stuff to cover, but this is the point. This is Arianism at this point. And remember, I've made several videos about what Dr. Hieser is saying, and when he first talked about how he gets Jews over the hump, is to have them understand how one God could be called God and how other things can be called God, but not in the same way, that they don't share the same attributes. That's Arianism. That Jesus is another God that can be called God, that he does not have the same attributes as the Father or the original God, which would be why he is not co-eternal and why he's called begotten, and how the word begotten would never be applied to the Father because it's ontologically, or it's a violation of what and who God the Father is. And so that's why the word begotten cannot be applied to him. And so if he's coming from the notion of trying to get Jews to understand by telling them that there is this ultimate God, and then there's other beings that are lesser beings that are called God, that the word entitled God does not mean that they have the same attributes as the original God, then Jesus is falling into this second category, and that's where he's coming from. So he's starting to teach where the Bible shows two Yahweh, and in that place it's showing you that there is evidence of this Arianism, or what's called Arianism. It existed before Arian. This whole theology, this whole belief system existed before Arianism, before the word term or ever, before even ever Arius was ever born. The point is, even before Jesus was born, it was already part of Judaism, and so it's evidence that the theme is consistent. The consistency from Judaism and the view of Judaism into Arianism is consistent. There's no new doctrine. There's no new viewpoint of who God is. God is still God, and there is this other lesser God. There's other beings who are representatively God and who are called God and all of that. It's consistent. And so it's something that we're looking at. He's pointing out, and I'm showing you that it's not going towards Trinity, but it's actually stopping at Arianism, which is saying there's one true God and some other beings who are called God, and Jesus being the only born God, literally child, offspring of God. So, very important what we're looking at here.
Everybody pick it out? Take a guess. It revolves around that fascinating subject of the use of person and number in grammar. Isn't that fascinating? Okay, now watch. We begin with the first person. I have wrought destruction among you. And we know from the end of it that the speaker is Yahweh. So he says, Yahweh says, I have wrought destruction among you, as when God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. You'll actually see this a number of times. Yahweh using both the first person and the third person. It just sounds odd. It sounds like there's some two thing going on. But it's just kind of weird. Like, what do we do with it? Look at this one.
Okay, so if you look at it, what he was reading before is that God was talking in the first person talking about another God who destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. And so if you look at or think about who is the God who, there was two Yahweh there at that point when Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. There was one Yahweh on earth, and there was one that called down fire and brimstone from the Yahweh out of heaven. And so the Yahweh that was on earth, right, and was the one who was requesting the fire from the Yahweh out of heaven, that Yahweh down there, that story is being relayed by Yahweh. And so in the verse here, you see here in the Amos verse, let's see if I can move it back. So Amos 4:11, he's saying, remember, I wrought destruction among you. That's Yahweh from heaven, because he delivered the brimstone, the fiery brimstone from heaven, as when God, who is Yahweh calling God, is the issue he's bringing up. Destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So he's saying God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, but what God? Well, the only born God. The fire, the destruction, or whatever came from Yahweh. And so at the request of the Yahweh on earth. And so he's calling him God because he's representatively God. And so that's the issue there, is that, or it could be the either way around. But the issue is that at the end of this verse, it says that it tells you that yet you have not turned back to me, declares Yahweh. And so Yahweh is the one who was speaking. And so Yahweh was speaking. One of the Yahweh was speaking about the other as God, and not himself. That's saying that I destroyed Yahweh, as when I destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm sorry. So it's different. He's talking about someone else in the third person. And it happens a lot. He's right. And it's something that you should look at. And it's something that shows that there is one who's being called God, and there's one who's being called Yahweh at this point. There's two. There's that let us make man in our image, but not consubstantiality. You're seeing Jesus and the Father, one God who is the uncreated God and a begotten God, and they are working together in tandem in the Old Testament. Jesus is the mediator. Jesus is no one, and remember that John chapter 1 verse 18, New American Standard, no one has ever seen God. That's the Yahweh, the Father. No one has ever seen God. The only born God, Jesus, the Son, the only born God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he had been revealing him. So that's why there is this duality. And then you might say, well, isn't that polytheism? It's monolatry. Monolatry was what the Moses was, and all of that. This is what monolatry is. Monotheism is not part of it. And when he started this whole conversation off, and you need to go to really need to watch all the videos that contain Michael Heiser's name on there to understand, he's already covered how there are other beings that are called God and how this issue is resolved. But this is the meat and potatoes. Very interesting look at how there is Jesus and the Father being identified in the Old Testament.
Weird. Like, what do we do with that? Look at this one. I didn't give you this one last week. This is Abraham and Isaac's story. God tested Abraham and said to him, verse 2, take your son, offer him as a burnt offering. We get down to verse 11. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. And he said, don't hurt the child. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your only son from me. Okay, here's the highlighting. If you want to look at the coloring, look at the interchange. God speaking about himself, and then he speaks about himself as though he's somebody else. First person, third person interchange. Again, this is not that rare in the Old Testament.
Okay, so Genesis 22, 1 and 2 says, God tested Abraham and said to him, verse 2, take your son, offer him as a burnt offering. So that's Genesis 22, 1 and 2. So he's saying, God tested Abraham, right? God tested Abraham. That's who's testing Abraham. And then in verse 11 it says, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, talking about the angel, right? And the word angel only means messenger. And so when you're seeing messenger, angel, it's the only messenger. It's not saying that this person is ontologically angel like the angel Michael, right? It's saying that he's a messenger. So, but the messenger of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now this messenger of Yahweh, I know that you fear God. You have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. So it said that God tested him, and then it says that this messenger of God was the one testing him. And so you're seeing, well, God tested him, but what God was the one that tested him? Right? What God? The begotten God? The messenger God? The only God that people can see? The only, mediator God who's out there, who's able to be seen and spoken and heard? This is the one that you're talking about? So this messenger, who is the message bringer of God, who is Jesus, he's saying, I know now that you have feared God because you have not withheld your son from me. But he is the mediator, right? He's revealing God to people. That's what John chapter 1 verse 18 says. So then you see that when it says God tested him, it could be talking about the only born God, the Son of God, testing, right? And when it's the messenger of the Lord called to him, it's a messenger who's going, the messenger God, the message bringer of God, who happens to be the Son of God, who happens to be in the form of God, who happens to be the image of God, who happens to be the only one that someone can see, and he's the one revealing God the Father. That's his role. He said, I don't say anything, I don't do anything without God telling me what to do. So you're understanding why the Bible is showing you that God is talking about someone else in the third person, when it's talking about a messenger, and then it's talking about you don't fear God, and you've not withheld it from me. The Bible seems to be calling this messenger of Yahweh a God, and it is calling this messenger. But Jesus is also called a God. But it's Jesus himself, out of his own mouth, said, that the Father is the only true God. And so you're getting to have to understand how, if Jesus is saying that the Father is the only true God, he is the messenger, the Shaliah, the representative, the wisdom, the logos of God. But he is not calling himself the only true God. He's calling the Father only true God. So you have to remember that Jesus did pre-exist, and he's the one that they're speaking about here because he's the one that people can see. John chapter 1 verse 18 tells you that he's the one who people can see. So everything that you're seeing here is affirmed that there is this other begotten God who is not the true God, but is the messenger of God, the Son of God. He's doing this. And so it's totally explained. And it's telling you that Jesus is the one who is being called, who's doing these things. And it's important. You have to see it.
I'm just showing you a few examples. But again, rabbis know their text really well. And they see this going on. And so we got to do something with it. What is going on? This is a book, if you are interested in the subject from a purely Jewish perspective. And I put this in here because if you do have Jewish friends, I told you last week, and especially tonight, if you're trying to do evangelism, you're trying to get your Jewish friend to at least consider Christian theology, Christianity, the claims of Jesus, the gospel. Their big problems are this whole monotheism thing and then the status of Jesus as God. Well, if you want to just give them something, they don't believe you. I don't believe that this used to be part of Jewish theology. This is the book right here. Now, it's an academic book, Two Powers in Heaven. Alan Siegel is a Jew. He just passed away last year. He was a Jew when he wrote it. He thinks the two powers idea is heretical. But he's a scholar, and he says, I know we used to believe this. And so he made it part of his life's work to chronicle the presence of Godhead thinking in Judaism, prior to the 2nd century.
Now, he's saying Godhead thinking, that he decided to chronicle the Godhead thinking. Honestly, in my opinion, is that this book, The Two Powers in Heaven, is chronicling the Arian type model, the Arian model in Judaism, and how he's proving, Alan Siegel, the existence of this divine plurality in Judaism before Jesus came and after Jesus came. Honestly, he's looking at the 2nd century, and it's showing where the Jews are starting to get away from. Essentially, he's chronicling how the Jews are shying away from their former belief in other beings being called God and changing to monotheism because they were monolatrists before. And in the 2nd century, when the Christians, like Justin Martyr, at the exact same time that this is going on, Justin Martyr is preaching and teaching Jews that Jesus is the Memra, that Jesus is this being, the second Yahweh in the Old Testament, this second God in the Old Testament. And Justin Martyr is calling him another God. And so because of all of this proof, the Jews who used to use this wisdom doctrine, this Memra, the Metatron, all of that, the Shalia, Shekinah, the name of God, it just moves on and on and on. It shows that there is this doctrine that Christians, they feel, Jews do, non-Christian Jews, that feel like the Christians have hijacked that idea, and now they're teaching that it's Jesus, and that's why there's such a convincing preaching going on that this Memra, that this wisdom, that this logos, that this angel or messenger of Yahweh came in human form and died as the Messiah for our sins, is a great story. And it's something that it was hard for them to refute. So they had to pull back and say, we can't talk about this anymore. We cannot talk about the Metatron. We can't talk about the Memra. We have to say there's only one God. We have to become more closed-minded and become monotheists instead of the monolatry that they had before. And so that's the issue that they're trying to get away from, because Christians are just having such a convincing argument about what's really going on. And so it's pretty amazing. So let's look at a closing of his statement, and then we'll end it there.
AD. Other things. Now we're going to go through thematically, and I'm going to introduce you to some biblical theological concepts.
Actually, we need to wait. So I want to shut this off right now because we're about almost 30 minutes long. And just the two Yahwehs, the angel of Yahweh and the name of Yahweh, that's something that we'll look in the next video. But realize that all of this he's teaching, there's no consubstantiality. There's no consubstantiality that he's looking at. He's just showing how there's two. And that's exactly what Arianism says, that Jesus is not the true God, that God had his son, and that Jesus was in the form of God before he became a human. That's why it's talking about in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with the God, which is Yahweh, and the Word was a God, or a divinity was the Word. And so that's talking about there being two, not necessarily one. There's no consubstantiality there, and it's talking about what the Logos is, which is a God, because if a human has a child, that child is human. If a God has a child, that child is a God, because that's what you would call it. And so because of that, Jesus is called God, but he is not the unbegotten, always existent God. And so because of that, there's a difference there. And that's Arianism. And that's what he's showing. There's two beings, and one is the Father, the unseen God. And in John chapter 1, verse 18, New American Standard tells you, there's one God who is not seen. No one has ever seen God at any time. This God is the Yahweh, the uncreated God. The only born God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he was revealing him. So this born God, it can be seen. That's why Jesus can be seen. That's why Jesus can be the mediator, can send the message, can speak, because he is that messenger, that mediator that's designed to be there and represent God. And God is not being seen directly in all theophanies, in all instances. And so that's what the Bible shows. And we'll look at all this next time. But for now, hope this is piquing your interest. Hope you're getting interested in seeing how the model of Judaism is identical to Arianism. The early church was Arian just by virtue of Justin's continuation of that argumentation. The Jews eventually in the 2nd century started moving away from this well-known doctrine of the Memra, the Logos, the Wisdom, the second Yahweh, the Metatron, the Memra, all of that, and moving away to saying nothing else is God but Yahweh, and that there's only one Yahweh and monotheism, but they're moving away from what they were before, which is monolatrous. That's why Philo can say that there was another God. That's why Philo can say that the Logos is God and that there's another God besides the Logos God, and how the Wisdom is considered that. I mean, it's the Targums. I mean, it just keeps going. Honestly, it just keeps going. And so this is proof of how Arianism started out pre-Arianism in Judaism. When Christ came, the story was this second God was Jesus. Jesus came in the form of man, and then it goes on and finishes the story off. That's how it came about, and that's what we're looking at. But it's not a Trinity. It's not a consubstantiality. And that's what I have a beef with. Everything else he's going to say, talking about all the verses, totally agree with. It's just that notion that it's Trinity is just the part I object to.